Well, here you go. I have transformed lighting, etc. Time has passed, not that much. And I am moving on to Zach's question, which is what are the best methods you've seen for dealing with character death in the context of challenge oriented games? You know, the normal problem of needing real risk and stakes, but dying is awkward because it takes you out of play. For a brief question, there's a lot in there. We'll start with some clarifications, context. First, challenge oriented games may be a bit of a code there. I think that, Zach, you're talking about games that I would say are related to Step On Up as far as the purpose, playing on purpose, is concerned. And I actually don't think that's relevant. Let's merely say that continuing to play has concepts that we can think of as failure. Failure of performance, failure of acumen. You know, someone can say, you lost that one in some unit of whatever that one may be. So, given that, needing real risk and stakes is applicable, but I also think that's applicable in play in general. So let's just clarify that. I think I see where you're specifying, but I don't think it has special properties. That is to say, character death has special properties. Okay, why would I say that? Obviously, it does. We all know, you lose your character, you lose, right? Well, let's think about this. You say the normal problem, and I will accept normal in the sense that we're talking about something that's widespread and even characteristic of a great deal of play. I don't accept it in terms of this is the reasonably expected outcome given all of the operating principles of what we do. I think that character death, dying is awkward because it takes you out of play, is an artifact. And without trying to define it away so that I don't have to answer your question, we still have to understand the nature of it as an artifact and what may be obscured. So this happens to be a portion of the course action in your action. And I therefore even printed out some of my slides to help me remember how I put this. The first is to point out that as a historical variable, one's character being alive or dead is built in an original context that I think has generally been lost. You may be familiar with this from me talking about this and playing Tunnels and Trolls a lot. But the concept that you're playing more than one character simultaneously. As those rules say, we have a handful of players, 2 to 4 people, maybe more, but not much more. And each of them with 2 to even 4 characters each. So that's a lot of characters played by a few people, and they're all running around together. It's a great big pack of folk, and that they may not all be together. Some may be off across the continent, some may be on shipboard somewhere, some may be sequestered down in their laboratory library making a magical item or something at any given point in play. But it's very likely that in the thicko combat, everybody is playing at least 2 characters, not just one. And this has multiple effects upon play and your experience of the characters. What it doesn't affect, and I think this is probably the big surprise to people who are just hearing me talk about this, it doesn't affect one's investment in those characters. It doesn't mean that you only have, it's like, what parents say, right? Love isn't like a pie. It's not like if I give a lot to your brother, that there's less for you, or something like that. Dubious as that particular claim may be, it does seem to apply pretty well in terms of playing role-playing characters. I definitely think there is something to the kind of investment that one may have in playing a single character, but I don't think that it's as binary as we make it, that if you're not doing that, if you're playing more than one at the same time, that somehow you're just not going to care about them at all. So the rules for dying, as established in those first 5 to 7 years of role-playing games, in which your character, kicks the bucket and that character is out of play because the character is dead, doesn't mean that the person stops playing. This also had a big role to play in a lot of those games in terms of character level or degree of expertise. You could end up after a while with a fairly diverse group of characters in terms of how skilled, experienced, or advanced, whatever you want to call it, that they may be. And that also was considered a normal thing. There are actually aspects of Tunnels and Trolls that make a lot more sense when you realize that a party in play or a troupe of characters in play is going to look like that more than they'll look like this kind of constant, everybody the same level up thing that has developed since then. Well, right now, I'm not actually offering that as the solution to what you're talking about. I'm talking about the origins of a historical artifact. When, through the course of time, and it was fairly abrupt, I think, and there are other contexts, such as tournament play, in which players get knocked out by losing characters. As this shift occurred, so that one game master and each player has a character, and that is that. Once that kind of gets established as the new normal, and it got established pretty quick, those death rules, which is basically, run out of a fairly meager set of points, especially to begin, and, sayonara to the character and to you. And then we have to come up with, well, we'll talk about compensations in a moment, but that is what I mean by an artifact. All of a sudden you are this single thing that you're invested in that is your contribution to play, and the rules are perfectly capable of simply, taking you away from it, which is bogus. It is. It's just bogus on the face of it. Compensating mechanisms kicked in instantly in the systems, and I'm talking about like by 1980. So very, very short period of time culturally. And the compensating mechanisms may be criticized as fictionally ridiculous, or they may be fairly imaginative in some cases, or they may be integrated into other economies of the game, like paying for resurrection and stuff like that. But basically, it means that you are always in a state of compensation and recovery. The rate of those things has to equal the rate of the loss, or else people can't play. So the degree of healing, the availability of constant replenishment, the notion that you have this very, realistic and gritty and, serious business about taking damage, and then you have this sort of sparkly, renewal happening all the time. As I say, it even as it became the butt of jokes, which you can see in the cartoons of Dragon Magazine from that time, it also became, standard, expected, even. There have also become other historical alternatives in the face of not wanting to do that for whatever reason. And one is that death becomes more voluntary and thematic, and that's not some latter-day thing. That actually it can be seen right there in the pages of Original Champions. There is literally no death moment by the numbers. And so if you look through, all these games, you'll find that either formal or informal or even vaguer compensations the character replacement, right? The joke started instantly. You know, your character has, the dust is still in the air from your character hitting, you know, the dirt, and out from behind the tree, you know, steps, I don't know, a new guy, a ranger who is strikingly well suited to, you know, hopping in. And so whether it's ridiculous or not isn't the point. The point is that these are all compensatory. Let me check my slide here, see if I've made my point. Oh yes, there are a couple of other interesting things. One is simply to reduce the statistical possibility of death, so that, you know, it's on paper, but it's kind of hard to get to. Champions does that, and then there's this kind of final moment where they kind of turn it into a thematic thing instead. But another is the damage isn't as bad as it looks. So you have different layers of damage. You have damage that kind of is stunning damage, or that basically you're making it more likely by the numbers that the character will be unconscious before anyone needs to worry about them dying. All of this does this weird dance with other trends during the 80s, for, you know, realism and, you know, exit wounds, whether, you know, bones get splintered on the way in or on the way out, you know, as far as the bullets are concerned, and more. So all of these, though, create this compensating situation so that you end up, especially in that business where you have, you know, that constant healing going on, which is very common in the, you know, the brutal, gritty, we're so realistic damage ones, that it's clear that death is, quote, possible. We're all somehow feel that it's not really a role-playing game unless that can happen, because that artifact was fixed so heavily early on, but that it doesn't really happen. And this transforms, you know, through the decades into this idea that, you know, only bad play, you know, should kill a guy off. You know, you were stupid. I won't kill a character unless the player is stupid. You know, that's kind of the good GM, you know, line of the time. This is, if you're saying, the problem. So in your question, where you have this statement of the normal problem of needing real risks and stakes, but dying is awkward because it takes you out of play, you're characterizing this uneasy state of, well, we've got a borked concept in the first place. And now how are we going to, you know, manipulate everything else so that we can at least stagger through it, or you know, wend our way around it through a series of, you know, throwing sand, or basically saying, well, we're not really just, we're just not playing the game, you know, at that point. We'll shift it into some other branch of logic at that point. And all of those, as I say, I think are in the context of that artifact. So if we remove that artifact from our thinking, and I'm not necessarily saying, okay, well, I'll just play multiple characters now. We're not turning back the clock. Playing Tunnels and Trolls that way is rather a blast, but, and as I say, has special qualities in that game. But that's not really the point. That's just talking about the origins of the issue. But I do want to remove that borked concept and say, well, wait a minute. What is it really that's going on here? If death is a playable event, does that mean that it ceases to matter? I mean, how it just doesn't matter, because that's what actually does end up happening when you have that, you know, instant character replacement. They come in, especially if they come in at the same level, and all sorts of things like that. What would it mean for death to be a playable event? Well, you can go the drama route, which is what a lot of people also have done, is say, well, you know, it can happen, but we're all supposed to be really, really, really sad about it. And it's a matter of profound drama. We shall all have a good cry, and then we will, you know, doesn't really answer the question of how do we keep playing. And then one of those other, replacement mechanisms or something, kicks in. By the time of the 90s, I suspect that so much avoidance was in place that much of the talk was performative, rather than really meaning much. There's a couple of interesting games where, you become an undead and stuff like that. All sorts of, you can find fictional ways in which character death just isn't character death. It is a form of change, and you keep playing the guy. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That is something to consider right there, is what happens when you play and your character dies and you keep playing. One is that death is just a change, and the character, it's like leveling up, basically, in games like Deadlands. But what about you keep playing, but the dude is dead? And there we can look at a game like The Mountain Witch. Whether there's a ghost, or literally, or whether there is the memory of the character and the mechanics thereof are played in much the same fashion as they had been played by the player before the character was dead, because there is a trust mechanic in The Mountain Witch, and that trust mechanic persists as play continues with that character dead. All of that is viable. But I still think that if we're focusing on the character death as the thing, that we're still stuck in the artifact. So I want to shift focus entirely. And I think this actually makes a big difference when we talk about the games I think you're the most interested in right now. So we are talking about losing. What if the real variable isn't character death, but is not getting what you want? You can mean in fiction or not, but it definitely means you as the participant. So that there's, and I don't mean like something, state what you want before the roll sort of thing. No, I mean something that you're actually invested in as play. And there's some aspect, and let's stay with fictional ones for now, that you want and that you're fighting for. You see, we need to also get out of the latter-day notion. All this content was looted by other media. So this notion of leveling up and moneying up and improving in the face of the risk of death and all the rest of it, that all gets looted into other media. And I think that its characteristics in those other media have sort of, distracted us. So we think that death in role-playing must be like death in those other media, and the fact that it looted it from role-playing, kind of reinforces that. But I don't think that's the case. Let's get our minds out of that. Let's say that we're talking about losing in terms of some other fictional quality. So all of a sudden, we have sort of a binary situation, or a two-variant situation. Character lives or dies, get what you want, don't get what you want. And that latter one, if that's the more important one, then the role that character death may play in that becomes a matter of a specific game's design. So that in one game, perhaps your character dying plays a big role in not getting what you want. Whereas in other games, it might not be quite as, as binary. Very crude forms of this might be seen in terms of, sacrifice your character to get a thing, or sacrifice your character to make it go the way you want. But I consider most of those to be particularly poorly done. I'll tag 10 Candles as a especially egregious example of looking that way and just making a hash of it. So if we focus on that as the quality of play that matters, when we have real risk and stakes, And if you don't associate that, the most important ones, with the character's life, then dying doesn't have to be awkward, and dying doesn't have to take you out of play. For lots and lots of examples, I can't give them to you because they're not well developed. We see some really interesting indications. One of the things I have as well in this part of the class is to take a look at two games that are really different at first glance. You would think they were the polar opposites in many ways. The aforementioned Mountain Witch and Albedo. So in Albedo, there is no story structure, right? You play in a continuous way with breaks in scenes or chapters or whatever, as somebody just says as we go along. And the Mountain Witch, in which those things have names, and you know that you are in chapter 3. So those are really different. The grain of detail per bit of contact point is really, really different. Albedo is phenomenally fine-grained. Just the character's mood shift from second to second in combat, let alone, facing and positioning and, round size and stuff like that. Or round size meaning, the caliber of the weapon. All of these things are really tightly known as very discrete, tiny units of rules contact. Whereas in the Mountain Witch, it's extremely coarse, and you have a single roll which handles a fair chunk of action or events at a time. Maybe not an entire scene or an entire combat or something, but a goodly chunk. So those are really different. And the playability of dead guys. In Albedo, you cannot play a dead guy. The dead guy bites the dust and now is an object in play and is not playable. And there doesn't seem to be any stated or understood way that you keep playing. Whereas in the Mountain Witch, of course, it is notable in that you do continue to play after your character dies. And in many cases, that's an extremely important role. Finally, you have an interesting similarity between those games in that each one has extremely significant relationship and emotional ties rules. Significant in terms of what your dice can actually accomplish for any number of actions, really any actions. So they are actually extremely similar in that regard. And that is an interesting key point, which in Albedo, where character death plays a big role in not getting what you want, and in the Mountain Witch, where it also plays a big role in not getting what you want for that character. So there's a lot more going on. There's in Albedo than one may think, in terms of, do I want, I don't want my character to die, but I really, really don't want to lose what I want. And sometimes the character dying can accomplish that, just like it can sometimes in the Mountain Witch. So it's a very, through the ties that are maintained, with other characters, and the impact on their emotions that your character has had. So there's some interesting nuances there to check out among games, some of which may surprise you as being relevant before we start running off for quick fixes. But the main thing, I think, first is to just lose that notion of identifying character death as awkward and taking you out of play just because it does, because that's an artifact. We can still have character death, and we can still have a loss at some level due to character death without it being the loss and without it being your participation. So much of that remains undeveloped, in my opinion. There have been moves in that direction for a number of games in a number of ways, and we can check them out. But as yet, each one is kind of its own little world of play solution or play alternative rather than something we can examine across them to generate a final point. The only thing I can to look across them is that business about what is a loss, what is the harshest loss, and how is character death made nuanced relative to that. So with any luck, that helps a bit.